She had no shoes left by mile 20. Her feet were wrapped in strips torn from her own skirt, soaked through with blood and dust. But she never let go of the reins. The stallion could have killed her. Every wrangler in 3 counties said so. But she talked to him soft and steady through the dark, through the cold, through the fear, and he followed her all the way to the gate of the man who would look her in the eye and call her a criminal. If that kind of woman deserves what she got, you need to hear this story to the very end. Before we begin, if stories about courage, injustice, and a love that nobody saw coming speak to your heart, please subscribe to this channel and follow along. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The stallion came in first. That was how people remembered it years later, when they told the story around supper tables and in barbershops and on church steps. They said they heard the hoofbeats before they saw anything slow and deliberate like a heartbeat that refused to quit. And then the great black horse walked out of the morning haze at the east end of Caldwell's Crossing, head low, nostrils blowing white vapor into the October air, and behind him, holding the lead rope in both bleeding hands, came a woman. She was young. That surprised them. Nobody expected young. Her dress had once been pale blue. Now it was the color of the road, gray-brown, caked at the hem, torn along the left side where the fabric had caught on something and pulled. One sleeve was missing entirely. In its place, wrapped tight around her forearm and tied in a careful knot, was a strip of the same fabric, dark with old blood. Her hair had come down from whatever arrangement it had started in and hung loose around her face, heavy with dust. She was not stumbling. That was the second thing people remembered. They expected stumbling. They expected collapse drama, the kind of theatrical suffering that made a good story. Instead, she walked straight. Her chin was level. Her eyes were fixed on the watering trough at the center of Main Street, like it was the only thing in the world that mattered, and every step she took was deliberate and measured, even though anyone looking close could see that each one cost her. The stallion matched her pace exactly. That alone was enough to stop the street cold. Hector Boone's black stallion Goliath, they called him, 17 hands of pure bad temper. The horse that had put 2 experienced hands in the infirmary and bitten clean through a stall door, the previous spring, walked beside this woman like a dog walks beside its owner. Calm, attentive, his enormous head turned slightly toward her every few steps, as though checking that she was still there. Mabel Greer was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the dry goods store when she looked up and stopped sweeping. Tom Pruitt stepped out of the barber shop with a towel still tucked into his collar and stood with his mouth open. 3 children who had been chasing a dog across the street froze in a cluster and stared. The woman reached the trough. She stopped. She waited while Goliath dropped his head and drank long and deep, and she kept her hands on the lead rope the entire time, never releasing it, even when her knees visibly shook. Only after the horse had finished did she cup her own hands in the water and press them against her face. She did it once. Then she straightened up again. It was Pruitt who finally moved. He stepped off the boardwalk and crossed toward her, and his voice, when it came out, had that careful tone men used when they weren't quite sure what they were dealing with. "Ma'am, you all right?" She looked at him. Her eyes were gray-green and clear, and that clarity seemed to catch him off guard. He'd been expecting confusion, maybe, or desperation. The wild look of someone who'd been through something terrible and hadn't come out the other side with their wits intact. Instead, she looked at him like she was the one deciding whether he was trustworthy. "I'm looking for Hector Boone," she said. Her voice was hoarse, probably from thirst, but the words came out clean and even. "This is his horse." Pruitt looked at the stallion. He looked back at her. "Where'd you come by him?" "Found him. Night before last, tangled in a gully wash about 8 miles south of the Creedy Pass Road. He'd pulled a stake and run from wherever he'd been tied." She paused. "Took me the better part of 2 nights and a full day to bring him in. He didn't want to come easy." Pruitt looked at her wrapped arm. He looked at the horse's haunches where 2 long, shallow scrapes showed through the dark coat already scabbing over and clean. "You doctored him," Pruitt said. "He had wire cuts. I cleaned them." She said it like it was obvious. Like, of course you clean the wounds. Is Hector Boone in town?" The silence that followed told her something was wrong before anyone said a word. It was Mabel Greer who crossed the street, then broom still in hand, and the look on her face was the complicated kind, the look of a woman deciding how much to say and to whom. "Hector Boone's been dead 3 years, honey," Mabel said. "That horse belongs to his son, Garrett Boone. The Double B Ranch about 4 miles north." She paused. "You walked that horse in from Creedy Pass?" "Yes, ma'am." "That's 30 miles. The woman didn't answer that. She didn't need to. Word reached Garrett Boone faster than it should have, which meant someone had already decided the story needed telling a particular way before he heard it. He came into town on horseback, moving fast, and he pulled up sharp in front of the trough with the kind of controlled violence that men practiced when they were furious and didn't want to show it too plainly. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, somewhere north of 30, with a jaw that looked like it had been set hard at some point and decided to stay that way. He wore his hat low and his expression lower. He looked at Goliath first. His eyes moved over the horse the way a man reads a letter, quick at first, then slower, taking in every detail. The scrapes on the haunches, the cleaned cuts, the saddle, which was his father's saddle, the good one with the silver conchos, still on the horse's back, nothing missing. Then he looked at the woman. She was sitting on the edge of the trough by then, because Mabel Greer had put a firm hand on her shoulder and said, "Sit down before you fall down," in a tone that didn't allow argument. Someone had brought a cup of water. The woman was holding it in both hands and hadn't yet drunk from it, which struck several observers as strange. Garrett Boone dismounted. He didn't say anything right away. He walked a slow circle around Goliath, running his hands along the horse's neck, checking the legs, lifting a hoof, and setting it down. The horse stood perfectly still for him, which was also something people noticed. Then he came around and stood in front of the woman. "Where did you find him?" he said. His voice was flat. Not cruel exactly, but flat, the voice of a man who had learned to keep everything behind it and only let out what he chose to let out. She told him. The same story she'd told Pruitt, except more detailed now, because this was the man who needed the details. The gully wash, the wire, the way the horse had fought the first half mile, and then somewhere around the old mining road had seemed to decide to trust her. The 2 nights walking, because she couldn't manage the horse in the dark, and had waited out the worst hours, sheltering in a dry creek bed, talking to him to keep him calm. Garrett Boone listened to all of it without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're telling me you walked that horse 30 miles, alone?" "Yes." "On foot?" "My horse threw me the first night, lost him in the dark." Garrett looked at her feet, the bloody wrappings. He looked at her face, which gave him nothing. No request for sympathy, no performance of suffering, just fact. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Wasn't headed anywhere particular," she said. "I was passing through." "Passing through from where?" There was a half-second pause, small enough that most people would have missed it, but Garrett Boone did not miss things. "San Marcos," she said. "On your own?" "Yes." Another pause. The street was very quiet. Everyone in earshot was working very hard at appearing not to listen. "What's your name?" he asked. "May Sutton." He let that sit there for a moment. "Well, May Sutton," he said finally, and his tone had shifted by the smallest possible degree, less flat, but not warm either, more like a man who was recalculating something. "That horse is worth more than most of what's in this town. You could have left him in that gully." "Yes," she said. "You could have stripped that saddle and sold the silver." "Yes." "But you didn't." "No." He looked at her for another long moment. "Why not?" May Sutton looked up at him then, and her gray-green eyes were tired and absolutely steady. "Because it wasn't mine," she said. It was Clay Ingram who ruined it. Ingram was the Double B's livestock foreman, and he'd ridden into town behind Garrett at a slightly slower pace, which meant he'd had time to hear what was being said on the edges of the crowd before he made himself known. He was a narrow-faced man with a careful way of speaking that some people confused for intelligence, and other people who had worked with him longer recognized as something else. He pushed through to the front and looked at May Sutton with the particular expression of a man who has already decided something and is now simply searching for evidence to support it. "Garrett," he said, "you want to think real careful here." Garrett turned to look at him. "She shows up with your horse," Ingram said, keeping his voice reasonable, the way a lawyer might keep his voice reasonable in front of a jury. "With your father's saddle with his rifle still in the scabbard. That horse has been missing 4 days. That rifle hasn't been seen since your father passed." He paused for effect. "That's a lot of your property for a passing stranger to be carrying." The crowd shifted. It was subtle, a slight rearrangement of postures of expressions, but May felt it. The way a room changes temperature. "I explained where I found him," she said, and she was looking at Garrett, not Ingram, because she had already understood that Ingram wasn't the one who mattered. "You explained a story," Ingram said. "Clay." Garrett's voice had an edge in it. "I'm just saying what people are thinking," Ingram said with the smile of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "There's been horses going missing from 3 ranches in this county over the past 6 weeks, and here's a woman nobody knows coming in from the direction where most of them disappeared, leading the most valuable horse in Caldwell's Crossing." He spread his hands. "I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm just saying it warrants looking into." The crowd agreed. May could hear it in the quiet, a settling, a solidifying, the way doubt becomes consensus before anyone actually votes on it. Mabel Greer made a sound of disapproval and was immediately ignored. Garrett Boone stood very still. May watched him. She watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, not slow, not stupid, but careful, the way a man thinks when he knows that whatever he says next is going to set something in motion. "You have anywhere to stay in town?" he asked her. His voice had gone flat again. "No." "Any money?" "Not much." He nodded once like he was filing that information. "Then you'll come out to the ranch," he said. "Until this gets sorted." She looked at him. "Am I under arrest?" "No." "A beat?" "Not yet." It was not reassuring. It was not meant to be. But it was the truth, and she understood somehow that with this man, the truth, even when it was hard, was more than she was going to get from most others in this street. She stood up, her legs held. "All right," May Sutton said. Yet, the ride out to Double B was 4 miles of silence, which was its own kind of conversation. Ingram had produced a spare horse from somewhere. May suspected it was a deliberate choice. The most placid animal in town, the kind of horse you gave someone you were treating as a threat, but didn't want to appear to be treating as a threat, and she rode it without complaint. Goliath walked alongside Garrett's horse without being led, which seemed to bother Ingram deeply, and Garrett not at all. Twice during the ride, the stallion turned his head and looked back at May. Garrett noticed. He didn't say anything. The ranch was large. May took that in without letting it show on her face, the extent of the fencing, the number of horses visible in the pastures, the size of the main barn, the bunkhouse that could sleep 20. Hector Boone had built something real out here. His son was maintaining it, maybe expanding it. That took work. That took the kind of relentless grinding attention to 1,000 details that most people never saw because they only saw the result. She understood that kind of work. There was a boy on the porch when they rode in, 8, maybe 9 years old, with his father's jaw already showing in the set of his face, and his mother's eyes, May guessed lighter. More open, the eyes of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide things. He watched them come in from the gate with the particular alertness of a child who has learned to read arrivals carefully. "Papa," he said, and in that single word, May heard a whole complicated question. "Go inside, Will," Garrett said. "Who is she? Go inside." The boy went, but he watched from the window, and May was aware of it. They put her in the tack room. It had a cot, which suggested this had happened before someone arriving and needing to be kept somewhere that wasn't quite the house, but wasn't quite the barn either. The somewhere in between of people who hadn't yet been decided about. She sat on the edge of the cot and unwrapped her feet in the dim light coming through the single window. The strips of fabric came off in layers, the outermost ones dry and stiff, the ones beneath still faintly damp. What was underneath was not good, but it was not as bad as it might have been. She'd kept things as clean as she could manage, packed the worst of it with strips of cleaner fabric when she could find it along the road. She was examining the damage with the focused, unemotional attention of someone doing a necessary job when the door opened. It was not Garrett. It was a woman middle-50s, compact, with the hands of someone who had worked hard for a long time, and the eyes of someone who missed very little. She was carrying a basin of water, a clean cloth, and a small tin that May recognized as a salve tin. "I'm Rosa," the woman said. She set the basin down and looked at May's feet without expression. "I run the house." "May." Rosa knelt down without asking permission and began to clean May's feet with the efficient gentleness of someone who had tended injuries before and found them neither dramatic nor remarkable. "You're the one who brought Goliath back," Rosa said. "Yes." "He let you lead him." "After a while." Rosa made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement, or might have been the beginning of an opinion she'd decided not to finish. She worked in silence for a moment. "How bad is it?" May asked. "You'll walk again in a week if you don't do anything stupid." Rosa looked up at her briefly. "So don't do anything stupid." "I'm trying not to." "Mr. Boone is not a bad man," Rosa said. It came out of nowhere the way things do when someone has been thinking them for a while and finally decides the moment is right. "He's a careful man. There's a difference." May looked at her. "He's got a lot to protect," Rosa continued. "The ranch, the boy, his father's name. Men like that don't move fast. They wait until they're sure. And if they're never sure..." Rosa tied off the clean bandaging and sat back. "Then you make sure they are," she said. She picked up the basin and stood. "I'll bring food." Go. Garrett Boone did not sleep that night. He stood at the window of his father's study, his study now, though he still thought of it as his father's, and looked out at the darkened ranch yard and thought about a woman who had walked 30 miles to return something that wasn't hers. He thought about the way she'd looked at him in town. Not asking for anything. Not performing gratitude or helplessness or innocence. Just answering his questions with the flat precision of someone who had told the truth before and had it disbelieved and had made peace with that possibility. He thought about Goliath walking beside her, like the horse had made a decision. Goliath had been his father's horse before he was May's. Before he was anybody's really, because that horse had never belonged to anyone except himself, and occasionally on his best days to Hector Boone. After his father died, Garrett had tried for 3 months to get the horse to accept a rider. He'd given up. He'd turned him out to pasture and told himself the horse was useful as a stud and didn't need to be ridden. He'd never fully believed it. What did it mean that a woman who'd never seen that horse before in her life could walk 30 miles in the dark and bring him home calm? What did it mean that she hadn't taken the rifle? The saddle silver was worth $60 at minimum. She'd arrived in town with almost nothing. She said she'd lost her own horse. What kind of person has nothing and finds $60 and leaves it where it is? The kind you couldn't afford to be wrong about. He went to the window that looked out toward the tack room. The light was out. She was sleeping, or at least lying in the dark. He stayed at the window a long time. In the morning, he found her in the barn. She was standing outside Goliath's stall, not inside it, not reaching over the gate, just standing near it, talking in a low, steady voice. The stallion had his head out and his ears forward, and was listening with the complete attention that horses gave to very few things. May heard Garrett come in, but she didn't turn around immediately. She finished what she was saying to the horse, something low and even, some run of words that wasn't meant to be overheard, and then she stepped back from the stall and turned. "I wasn't doing anything," she said, and then seemed to recognize how that sounded and added, "I just wanted to see how the cuts were healing." "How are they?" "Good. Clean." Garrett came and looked over the stall gate himself. He stood beside her without quite looking at her, both of them facing the horse. "What were you saying to him?" he asked. There was a pause. I was telling him he did well, she said. Getting home. Garrett looked at the horse. The horse looked back at him with the flat amber eyes that had looked at him with varying degrees of tolerance for years. He doesn't usually stand that close to the gate, Garrett said. I know. He moved toward me. Another silence. Ingram wants me to send you back to town, Garrett said. Have the marshal hold you while he rides out to verify your story. May didn't move. He thinks you stole some horses, Garrett said. Over the past 6 weeks, he thinks maybe you recognized Goliath and saw an opportunity. What do you think? May said. Garrett turned and looked at her for the first time since he'd come into the barn. Fully looked at her the way he hadn't let himself do in town, because there had been too many eyes on him, and he'd learned a long time ago to be careful about where his attention landed in public. She looked back at him without flinching. I think, he said slowly, that a person who intends to steal from you doesn't usually return your most valuable horse. No, she agreed. They don't. But I also think, he continued, that if you're lying to me and I let you stay on this ranch and my son is here, I'm not lying to you. The words came out quiet and absolute. Garrett Boone looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Goliath. The horse had not moved. You can stay, Garrett said finally. You need time to heal before you go anywhere, and I need a few days to get a man out to Creedy Pass to look at what you described. He paused. After that, we'll see. I'm not asking for charity, May said. I know. I can work. Whatever needs doing. He was quiet for a moment. Can you break horses? He asked. She looked at him steadily. I've done it, she said. He nodded slowly like a man filing something away. Then we'll see, he said again. He turned and walked back out of the barn, and behind him, Goliath stretched his great dark neck over the gate and watched him go with those flat amber eyes. May stood very still for a moment. Then she turned back to the horse. Don't look at me like that, she said quietly. The horse's ear swiveled toward her. I know, she said. Me too. Rosa brought breakfast at dawn biscuits, salt pork black coffee, and set it on the floor of the tack room without ceremony because there was no table. May ate every bite. She'd learned a long time ago not to leave food when she didn't know when the next meal was coming, and that lesson had never fully left her, even in better times. She was pulling her boots on when Will appeared in the doorway. He didn't knock. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets and his father's measuring expression on his 9-year-old face, looking at her the way children look at things they've been told not to touch, but can't stop being curious about. Papa said I wasn't supposed to come out here, he said. May looked at him. Then why are you here? I wanted to see you. You're seeing me. He considered that. You really walked 30 miles. Yes. With Goliath. He walked, I walked. We walked together. Will thought about this with the seriousness that children brought to facts they found genuinely remarkable. He bit Clem Hadley so bad Clem couldn't use his hand for a month, he said. Clem's the best horse hand we got. Goliath bites people who grab at him, May said. He doesn't bite people who ask. Horses don't understand asking. That one does. She stood up and looked at the boy directly. What's your name? Will, William Hector Boone. He said the full name the way boys did when they'd been told it mattered. My grandfather was Hector. I know. That was his saddle I brought back. Something moved across Will's face. Grief maybe, or the edge of it the way children touched grief sideways because straight on was too much. I never met him, Will said. He died before I was old enough to remember. May didn't say she was sorry. She said, he had good taste in horses. And for the first time, Will Boone almost smiled. It vanished when Clay Ingram appeared behind him in the doorway, and the look Ingram gave the boy sent him scrambling back toward the house without another word. Ingram watched him go, then turned to May with the pleasant expression of a man who had learned to make his worst intentions look like good manners. Mr. Boone wants you to help with the breaking pen this morning, he said. "We got 3 green horses that need groundwork." May looked at him steadily. "All right." "I'll be watching," Ingram said. "I expect you will," she said. He didn't like that. She could see it, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his smile stayed fixed while something behind it adjusted. Men like Ingram were accustomed to making women nervous. She had been nervous of men like him before, and it had cost her, and she had decided some time ago to stop paying that particular price. She picked up her hat and walked past him into the morning. The 3 green horses were young, barely saddle-broke, and the first one, a raw-boned gray, went straight to the back of the pen and stood there with her ears flat and her eyes white-rimmed, broadcasting everything she was feeling to anyone paying attention. 2 of the ranch hands leaned on the fence rail and watched May come in. She heard one of them say something low to the other, and the other one laughed, and she filed that away and didn't react to it. She didn't go to the gray horse. She walked to the center of the pen and stopped. She stood there. She looked at nothing in particular. She waited. It took 6 minutes. She counted them in her head, knowing the hands were watching. Knowing Ingram was watching from somewhere behind her. Knowing that every second she stood still was a second she appeared to be doing nothing, which was a thing that made people like Ingram impatient and dismissive, which was exactly what she needed. The gray horse moved first. 1 step. Then another. Then she stretched her neck out and blew a long breath toward May. And May didn't move. Just let the horse come to her. Let the animal make the decision on her own terms. And when the gray's soft nose finally touched her shoulder, one of the hands on the fence said, "Well, I'll be damned." And she heard it clearly and chose not to smile. By noon, she had all 3 horses moving on a lead without resistance. Garrett Boone watched from the barn doorway for the last 40 minutes of it. She knew he was there but didn't look at him until she came out of the pen and he was still standing there. "Clem tried 3 days on that gray," he said. "Clem probably tried to make her," May said. "You can't make a scared animal trust you. You just have to be worth trusting and wait." Garrett looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a crack in the flatness, like light coming under a closed door. "Ingram rode out this morning," he said, "to Creedy Pass, to check your story." May's stomach went tight, but she kept her face still. "How long will he be gone?" "Day and a half, maybe 2. "All right." "If he finds what you described," Garrett said, "we'll talk." "And if he doesn't," Garrett held her gaze, "then we'll also talk." It was not a threat. It was not quite a promise either. It was the kind of honesty that lived in the space between, and May understood it for what it was. "Fair enough," she said. She turned to go, and he said, "May." She stopped. "Will you eat supper with us tonight?" His voice was careful in the way of a man who didn't ask things easily. "At the house. Rosa sets a table." She turned back. "Is that an offer or an order?" A beat. The corner of his mouth moved barely, almost nothing. "It's an offer." "Then yes," she said. "Thank you." She walked back to the tack room to wash her hands, and behind her she did not hear him move for a long moment. Supper was a test, and everyone at the table knew it. Rosa had cooked well. There was a pot roast and cornbread and beans, and the table was set with the kind of deliberate care that said this house had once had a woman running it who believed in doing things properly, and that Rosa had taken up that standard and refused to let it drop. Will sat across from May and ate in focused silence, but every few minutes he would look up at her as though checking that she was still there and still real. Garrett ate and spoke little, which she was coming to understand was simply how he moved through the world. He wasn't cold. He was contained. There was a difference, like Rosa had said, not that May had decided to trust that yet. It was Will who broke the careful quiet. "How come you don't have a husband?" he asked. "Will," Garrett said. "I'm just asking." May said, "I had one. He died." Will absorbed this. "My mama died too," he said, 2 years ago. He said it the way children said hard things directly without performance, because they hadn't yet learned to dress grief up before presenting it. Papa doesn't talk about her much. Will. Garrett's voice was quiet with an edge. I talk to Goliath about her sometimes. Will continued untroubled. But he never talks back. You talk to him, though. He looked at May. What do you talk to him about? May considered the question seriously. Whatever's true, she said. Horses know when you're lying. Will looked at his father. Is that true, Papa? Garrett was quiet for a moment. Some horses, he said. Goliath knows, Will said with the absolute certainty of a child who had made up his mind. He came back to you, he told May. He didn't have to. Nobody makes Goliath do anything. The table went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Something had been said that mattered, and all three of them felt it, and nobody reached for it directly. After supper, May helped Rosa clear the table. Garrett stood in the doorway of the parlor and watched the lamplight and said nothing. Will lingered as long as he could before Rosa pointed at the stairs, and he went up. On her way back to the tack room, May stopped. Garrett was standing on the porch. She was a good horsewoman, he said without preamble, like he'd been building toward it all evening and had finally decided. May stopped. Your wife? Yes. He was looking out at the dark yard. She grew up on a ranch in Colorado. She could read a horse better than most men I've known. A pause. She would have had that gray eating out of her hand in 20 minutes instead of 6. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her. It cost him something she could tell the slight tension in his jaw, the careful way he was looking at nothing. She sounds like she was something, May said. She was everything, he said quietly. Then, as though catching himself, he added, she was a good mother. Will has her eyes. I noticed. Silence. You're not what Ingram said you were, Garrett said suddenly. May looked at him. No, I know that. He said it like he was admitting something he'd been arguing with himself about. I knew it yesterday. I'm a careful man, not a stupid one. Then why are you waiting on Ingram to come back? She asked. She kept her voice even, not accusing, just asking. He turned and looked at her. Because in this county, he said, what a man knows in his gut and what he can stand behind in public aren't always the same thing. And I have a son and a ranch and a reputation that keeps both of them safe. He held her gaze. That's not an excuse. It's a fact. May was quiet for a moment. I understand that, she said finally. I don't like it, but I understand it. He nodded slowly. Good night, May Sutton, he said. Good night, Mr. Boone. She walked back to the tack room in the dark, and she was almost there when she heard it. Voices. From the bunkhouse. Low and deliberate the way men talk when they're not hiding what they're saying, but not broadcasting it either, comfortable in the assumption that the person they're talking about can't hear. She stopped. She didn't mean to listen. But her name came through the wall of the bunkhouse clear as a stone thrown into still water in Ingram's voice, and Ingram was supposed to be riding to Creedy Pass. Ingram had not left. She stood very still in the dark. Woman's got him turned around already, Ingram was saying. You see the way he looked at her at supper, asked her to eat at the table. The table Denny, his wife's table. Another voice Denny, she assumed said something May couldn't catch. It doesn't matter what her story checks out to, Ingram said. That's not the point. The point is, she cannot be here. She cannot be inside this ranch, inside that house, inside his head. A pause. So you're going to make sure she leaves? May's hands were very still at her sides. How? Denny said. I'll handle the how, Ingram said. You just do what I tell you, and keep your mouth shut. Boone finds out I'm still here. Tell him my horse threw a shoe. I'll be on the road before first light. Silence. May walked the rest of the way to the tack room and sat down on the cot in the dark. Her heart was beating fast, and she made herself slow it. She made herself think. Ingram had not ridden to Creedy Pass. He had stayed. He was planning something. And whatever it wasn't a confrontation. It was the kind of thing that happened sideways in the dark, in ways that left a woman with nothing to stand on and no one to stand beside her. She thought about leaving. She turned it over honestly in her mind, because she had learned to be honest with herself even when it was uncomfortable, especially when it was uncomfortable. She could saddle the spare horse in the dark. She could be 5 miles gone before anyone woke. She owed Garrett Boone nothing legally speaking. She had returned his horse. Her debt, if there had been one, was paid. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she thought about Will asking what she talked to Goliath about. Whatever's true. She thought about Rosa. Then you make sure they are. She thought about a man standing on a porch in the dark, saying she was a good mother, with his voice doing the thing voices did when they were carrying something almost too heavy to put down. May Sutton lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling. She was not going anywhere. In the morning, she found the thing Ingram had arranged. It was small as these things went, the kind of small that was designed to grow. 3 of the ranch hands from the bunkhouse were in the yard when she came out, and they looked at her with the particular expression of men who had been told a story about her that they'd decided to believe. Not hostile, not yet, but certain. The kind of certain that came from the outside, from someone else's telling, and wore itself as easy confidence. One of them, a big sunburned man she'd heard called Prentice, stepped into her path. "You're in the wrong place, lady," he said pleasantly. May stopped. "Am I?" "Ingram says you came from the direction of the Holt Ranch loss. 14 horses 2 weeks back." He shrugged like he was just reporting facts. "Makes sense you'd try to bring one back to cover your tracks." May looked at him steadily. "Where's Mr. Boone?" "Inside, having his breakfast." Prentice smiled. It didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "I'd hate to trouble him over nothing." "It's not nothing," May said. "Ingram says—" "Ingram didn't go to Creedy Pass last night," May said. The smile flickered. "He was in the bunkhouse," she said. "I heard him. He told a man named Denny to make sure I leave. I don't know what he's been telling you this morning, but I'd think about why he needs me gone before I take his word on anything." Prentice stared at her. 2 of the other hands exchanged a look. She didn't wait for them to decide. She walked past Prentice to the house and knocked. Rosa opened the door and May said, "I need to talk to Garrett Boone. Right now." Garrett came to the door of the dining room with his coffee cup still in his hand and looked at her face and set the cup down. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it. Ingram still on the property. The conversation through the bunkhouse wall. Prentice in the yard this morning. She kept her voice level and factual and fast because she understood that if she showed fear, it would read as guilt, and if she dressed it up, it would read as storytelling. Garrett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You're sure it was Ingram's voice?" "I'm sure. And you're sure he said make sure she leaves?" "Yes." Another pause. She could see him working it, not doubting her, she thought, but weighing it, turning it, looking at the shape of it from every angle. "Why would Ingram want you gone that badly?" he said. It was a genuine question. She could see he didn't have the answer yet. "I don't know," she said. "But whatever it is, it's not about me. I walked into this town 30 hours ago. I'm nobody to him. It's about something here." She held his gaze. "Something on this ranch." He was very still. "That's a serious thing to say." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." The silence stretched between them. And in it, May felt the whole weight of being believed or not believed, hanging in the balance the way it always did. The way it had her whole life, the way it did for women who told true things to men who had to choose between the comfortable story and the complicated one. Garrett Boone put his coffee cup on the shelf beside the door. "Rosa?" he called. Rosa appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Where is Ingram right now?" Rosa's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. "Saddling up at the east gate," she said. "Looked like he was finally heading out." Garrett moved. He moved fast for a big man through the front door off the porch across the yard at a pace that wasn't quite a run, but was close enough that Prentice and the two hands near the barn got out of his way without being asked. May followed at a distance that said she was not hiding, but was not going to make his business harder by being in the center of it. Ingram was mounted when Garrett came around the corner of the barn. His horse was pointed at the east gate, and his body language was the studied casualness of a man who had timed his departure to avoid exactly this conversation. "Clay," Garrett said. Ingram turned. His face arranged itself into something friendly and slightly confused. "Morning, Garrett. Just heading out to Creedy. You were here last night." It landed flat. Not a question. Ingram paused for one beat too long. "Had to wait on the shoe," he said. Blackie threw, "Tell me what you said to Denny last night," Garrett said. "In the bunkhouse. About May Sutton." The silence was its own kind of answer. Ingram's eyes moved to May and back to Garrett, and in that movement something changed in his face, the friendly confusion thinning away to something underneath it that was older and harder and less carefully managed. "Garrett," he said, and his voice had shifted to the reasonable tone, the lawyer tone. "You've got a woman on your property you don't know anything about. I'm trying to protect you. I'm trying to protect Will." "Don't," Garrett said. The single word hit like a door closing. Ingram stopped. "Don't use my son's name to cover whatever you're doing," Garrett said. "We've worked together 4 years. I've trusted your word on horses, on men, on land deals. But you will look me in the eye right now and tell me why a woman who walked 30 miles to return my horse needs to be gone from this ranch bad enough that you'd sit in the dark and arrange it instead of coming to me." The yard was very quiet. Ingram's jaw tightened. "She's not what she looks like," he said finally. "Neither are you," Garrett said. "It turns out." Something flashed across Ingram's face. Anger maybe, or the edge of something that was afraid of what anger might shake loose, and then he reined his horse back and said, "You're going to regret this." It didn't come out like a prediction. It came out like a warning. And May, standing 20 feet back, heard the difference clearly. Garrett heard it too. "Ride to Creedy Pass," he said. "Verify her story. Come back with what you find. That's your job. Nothing else." Ingram rode out. He didn't look back. Garrett stood in the yard and watched him go until he was through the gate and the dust had settled. Then he turned and looked at May. "I owe you an apology," he said. She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." "I do," he said. "I should have asked him straight last night instead of giving him the morning to—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "That's on me." "You're a careful man," she said, and she meant it without sarcasm. "Careful men verify things." He looked at her for a long moment. "What he said," Garrett said slowly, "about you not being what you look like. He knows something he didn't want to say with me watching." He paused. "Something about you or something about himself." May thought about the 14 horses from the Holt Ranch. She thought about the hidden brand she'd noticed on one of the pasture horses during morning chores, a brand that looked a little too new under a coat that was a little too muddy for the weather. She almost said it. She stopped herself, because she wasn't sure. Not yet. And in her experience, an accusation made too early without proof solid enough to hold didn't just fail, it turned around and was used against the person who made it. "Let Ingram come back with what he finds at Creedy Pass," she said. "Then we'll see what he says." Garrett nodded slowly. "And between now and then," May said, "I'll work, and I'll watch." He held her gaze. "Watch carefully," he said. "I intend to," she said. She went back to the breaking pen, and she did work hard, focused, careful work. But underneath every movement her mind was turning over the thing she hadn't said, the thing that was still half-formed and therefore dangerous. The mud-covered brand. The horses that had come in during the past 3 weeks in small groups, brought in by Ingram, logged by Ingram, moved to the far pasture that Garrett didn't ride through daily. She thought about Ingram's face when she said the word Creedy Pass. Not confused, not open, closed. The face of a man who already knew exactly what was at Creedy Pass and didn't want anyone else to find it. By evening, May was certain of it. She was also certain that certainty on its own was worth nothing. She needed something she could put in someone's hand. Something that couldn't be talked around, reasoned past, explained away. Will found her at dusk, sitting outside the tack room. "You didn't leave," he said. She looked at him. No. He seemed to consider this as though it was information he was still deciding what to do with. "Prentice said you were going to leave," Will said. "This morning. He said women like you always do." May looked at him carefully. "What kind of woman does Prentice think I am?" Will frowned in the serious way he had. "He said the kind that shows up from nowhere and disappears back into it." He paused. "I don't think that's true." "Why not?" The boy looked at her with those light, open eyes, his mother's eyes. "Because Goliath's been standing at the fence watching that road since Ingram left," he said, "and he only watches the road for things he wants to come back." May was quiet. "He's never done that for anybody," Will said. "Not since Grandpa." May looked out at the fence where, sure enough, the black horse stood with his head up facing east. She sat with that for a long time after Will went inside. She was still sitting there when Rosa brought the supper she'd forgotten to come in for and set it down beside her without a word, and went back to the house, and the lamp in Garrett Boone's study window burned late into the night. And in the far pasture, 3 horses stood in the dark with brands that weren't what they appeared to be, and somewhere between Caldwell's Crossing and the Creedy Pass Road, Clay Ingram was deciding exactly how much he could afford to let a man like Garrett Boone find out. Ingram came back the next morning with a look on his face that May recognized before he even dismounted. It was the look of a man who had decided which story he was going to tell. She was in the breaking pen when she heard the hoofbeats, and she turned and watched him ride through the east gate with 2 men she didn't recognize flanking him, townsmen from the look of their clothes, not ranch hands. One of them had the broad, flat chest of a man accustomed to authority. The other had a notebook. Garrett came out of the barn, found the sight. Ingram called out, still mounted loud enough for every hand in the yard to hear. "Creedy Pass, just like she said. There's a man buried there, all right." He paused, letting it land. "But it ain't what she told you." May walked to the fence of the pen and watched. "The man buried there," Ingram continued, "was carrying no payroll, no valuables. Nothing was taken from him." Another pause. "But there was a campfire nearby. Recent. Woman's boot prints around it. Small boot. Her size." He looked directly at May across the yard. "And the horse was tied there, not tangled in wire. There's a stake hole in the ground clear as daylight." The 2 men with him had dismounted. The one with the broad chest stepped forward. "Deputy Marshal Cord Haynes," he said to Garrett. "I'll need to ask Miss Sutton some questions." May felt the yard shift around her. The hands who had started to warm to her over the past 2 days, who had watched her work, who had nodded to her at meals, took a half step back. Not dramatic, just enough. The way people moved when they were deciding not to be associated with something. Garrett turned and looked at May. She met his eyes across the yard and said nothing, because there was nothing she could say with 20 people watching that would sound like anything other than defense. And defense looked like guilt when the ground was already tilted. The deputy walked toward her. "Miss Sutton, you want to tell me what really happened at Creedy Pass?" "I told Mr. Boone exactly what happened," she said. "A man was dying. I helped him. I took his horse because he asked me to. That's all there is." "The dead man had enemies," Haynes said. "You know anything about that?" "I didn't know the man. I found him dying. His name was Pete Carver. He was a small rancher, ran about 40 head north of the Creedy Road." Haynes watched her face. "Mean anything to you?" "No." "He'd reported stolen horses to the county 3 weeks ago, 14 head. Haynes let that sit. "Same number went missing from the Holt Ranch the week before." May's jaw tightened. She made herself breathe. "I didn't steal any horses," she said. "Then why were your boot prints at his camp?" "Because I camped there. I told you. I was with him when he died. I buried him." "Convenient," Ingram said from somewhere to her left. "Clay," Garrett said sharp. But the damage was already moving through the yard like fire through dry grass. She could feel it in the silence, in the way Prentice had straightened up, in the way the notebook man was writing, without being asked any questions yet. Haynes said, "Miss Sutton, I'm going to need you to come with me to town." "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet. Just questions." She looked past him at Garrett. Garrett's face was doing the thing she'd seen before, the calculation, the weighing, the careful man's instinct to wait before committing. And she understood it. She had said she understood it, but standing on this side of it with a deputy between them felt different than it had on the porch in the dark. She looked at him for one long moment. Then she looked at Haynes. "All right," she said. "I'll come." She walked toward the gate, and as she passed Ingram's horse, she looked up at the man directly. Ingram's expression was carefully neutral, the way a card player looked at a hand he'd already won. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. "You left something out," she said quietly. He didn't blink. "Ma'am, when you were at Creedy Pass." She kept her voice low, meant only for him. "You left something out of what you told them." His neutral expression didn't change, but his left hand tightened on his knee, and she filed that away and kept walking. The ride to Caldwell's Crossing was the longest 4 miles of her life. Not because of the deputy who rode beside her in professional silence, not because of the second man who rode behind. It was because of the thinking she was doing, the furious, grinding, relentless thinking of a person sorting through what they had versus what they needed, and finding the distance between them vast and inconvenient. She had suspicion. She had a mud-covered brand on a horse in Garrett Boone's far pasture. She had a foreman who had stayed on the property instead of riding out, who had arranged to have her frightened off, who had come back with 2 men and a twisted version of events. What she didn't have was a single piece of it that she could put in someone's hand. She thought about this for 4 miles. She thought about what Ingram had said. The stake hole in the ground. Carver's horse had been tied there, not tangled in wire. Except she had untied the horse herself. From a wire snag in the gully wall 6 feet below the edge where the camp had been. She had climbed down in the dark, and she had bled from the gully wire on her left arm, and she had the scar to show it, faint now, 5 days healed, but there. She had the scar. She pressed her arm against her side and felt the faint pull of healing skin and thought, "That's something." In town, Haynes took her to the marshal's office, which was small and smelled of old paper and tobacco, and sat her down across a desk from a heavy-set man with a gray mustache, who introduced himself as Marshal Vern Cutter, and looked at her the way men looked at problems they hadn't asked for. He asked her the same questions the deputy had asked. She answered them the same way, except this time she pushed up her left sleeve and put her arm on the desk. "Wire cut," she said. "From the gully. If the horse was tied at the camp with a stake like Ingram told you, I wouldn't have this." Cutter looked at the scar. He looked at Haynes. He said, "Clay Ingram told you there was a stake hole." "Yes, sir," Haynes said. "I want to see that ground myself," Cutter said. He was not rushing. He was not convinced. But he was not dismissing her either, and that was more than she'd expected. Haynes said, "I can take you out tomorrow." "Today," Cutter said. He stood up. "Miss Sutton, you'll stay in town while we verify." He looked at her. "You got somewhere to go?" "No." He looked at the scar on her arm again. "Mabel Greer takes in boarders," he said. "I'll tell her you're coming." It was not freedom. It was not trust. But it was not a cell, and she took it. Mabel Greer's house was on the east side of Caldwell's Crossing, 2 blocks from the marshal's office, and Mabel herself was exactly the kind of woman who appeared soft and turned out to be granite. She opened the door, looked May up and down once, and said, "I heard about you. Come in." And that was the entirety of her judgment. She gave May a room, a hot meal, and a basin of clean water. And when May came downstairs an hour later with her hair combed and her face washed, Mabel looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "Ingram's been talking." May sat down. "Telling me or warning me?" "Both." Mabel poured coffee. "He's been in the saloon since he rode in." He's telling anyone who'll listen that you're connected to the horse theft ring that's been running through this county for 2 months. She set the pot down. He's got a way of talking that makes people feel like they're hearing something important. Men like that always do. What are people saying? Well, about half believe him. About a quarter think he's got a personal interest in making you look bad and are waiting to see why. Mabel sat down across from her. The rest don't care either way. May wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. What do you think? She asked. Mabel looked at her steadily. I think a woman who steals horses doesn't walk them 30 miles back to the owner. I think a woman running from something doesn't stop to bury a dying stranger. She paused. And I think Clay Ingram is a man who gets nervous when other people start looking at things he'd rather have left alone. May was quiet. That horse in the far pasture, she said carefully. The one with the mud-covered brand. Mabel's eyes sharpened. You saw it. 2 days ago. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure enough. How sure are you now? Sure enough. May looked at her. What do you know about Ingram and Boone's operation, the horses that come in from his buying trips? Mabel was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about something, deciding about it. 3 ranches have reported horse thefts in this county, Mabel said finally. The Holt Ranch, Pete Carver's place, and the Dunbar spread east of town. She paused. Every theft happened within 2 days of Ingram making a buying trip in that direction for Boone. The silence in the kitchen was very loud. Does anyone else know this? May said. I know it, Mabel said. The problem is, I'm a woman who runs a boarding house. What I know doesn't carry the weight it needs to carry against a foreman who's been trusted by one of the biggest ranches in the county for 4 years. May stood up. It will, she said, when there's something to back it up. She went upstairs, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she thought hard and fast, because she understood now that whatever Ingram was planning, he was planning it quickly. He had not expected Cutter to ride to Creedy Pass himself. He had expected the deputy's word to be enough May to be locked up and the whole thing to close down around her before anyone looked too closely at the far pasture. He was recalculating, and men who were recalculating made moves. She was still thinking when she heard hoofbeats in the street outside, and she went to the window and looked down, and Garrett Boone was dismounting at the rail in front of Mabel's house. She was down the stairs before Mabel finished calling her name. He came in the front door, and he looked at her, and something in his face was different from everything before, not flat anymore, not contained. He looked like a man who had opened a door he hadn't known was there, and found a room he needed to reckon with. There's a brand on a horse in my far pasture, he said. I went out there after you left. I cleaned the mud myself. His jaw was tight. It's not a double B brand. It's a modified Holt brand. May said nothing. There are 2 more, he said. I missed them because I trusted Ingram to log all incoming stock. He stopped. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger, or not only anger. Something that hurt. 4 years. He's been running stolen horses through my operation for at least... He stopped again. You didn't know, May said. I should have looked. He's a careful man, she said. In the wrong direction, but careful. Garrett looked at her. He's using your ranch as a pass-through, May said. Bring them in change, the brands move them on. And if anyone ever looks too closely, there's a foreman to take the blame, and a paper trail that leads to the double B. And you, Garrett said slowly, showed up from the wrong direction at the wrong time, asking for me by name, carrying a horse that would put you in my yard for days. Long enough to start noticing things. He was quiet. I need to get to Cutter before Ingram does, Garrett said. Cutter's already riding to Creedy Pass. Then I need to get out there first. He turned for the door. Garrett. She said his name without thinking, and he stopped. Ingram knows you went to the pasture. He'll have had someone watching. She paused. He knows what you found. The implication of that landed between them. Ingram was not a man who waited for things to happen to him. He arranged things. He had arranged her arrival into a crime. He had arranged the deputy. He had arranged the stories in the saloon. A man like that cornered, didn't run. He made something burn. Garrett's face changed. "Will is at the ranch," he said. He was already moving. They rode hard, and they rode together, and May didn't ask, and he didn't explain, and somewhere on that 4-mile road, they both understood that the careful, measured, polite distance between them had collapsed into something more immediate and more honest, the way distances always collapsed when something real was on fire. They came through this gate at a run, and the first thing May saw was Rosa on the porch, with her hands clasped in front of her, and her face doing something it had not done in any of the 2 days May had known her. Rosa looked afraid. "Will," Garrett said, already off the horse. "He's here," Rosa said. "He's safe. But—" And then they heard it. From the south barn, where the 3 green horses were stalled. A sound that started low and became something else very fast. The particular high-pitched shrieking of horses that were beyond afraid, and the smell that followed it was the smell that meant everything. Smoke. Garrett ran. May ran 2 steps behind him, and what she saw when she came around the corner of the barn was a wall of orange light eating through the south wall, with a speed and direction that did not look like accident, and Ingram's second horse, not the one he'd ridden in on the spare horse he'd kept stabled, gone from its post. He had been here. He had already been here. The hands were stumbling out of the bunkhouse. Someone was yelling for water. Someone else was yelling that the pump was frozen, which wasn't true, which meant they were panicking and not thinking, and the horses inside the south barn were screaming and throwing themselves against the stall doors. Garrett reached the barn door and pulled it open, and the smoke poured out, and he went in anyway. May was behind him. She pulled her jacket over her face, and she moved fast, using sound the way you had to, when you couldn't see, locating each horse by its voice, moving to the nearest stall. Getting the latch, talking loud and steady over the roar of the fire. Because if the horses couldn't hear her, they wouldn't move. And she had learned years ago that a terrified horse needed a voice more than hands needed. A sound that said, "Something is in charge here. Something knows the way out. Follow it." She got the gray first because she knew the gray's voice, and the horse came out of the stall hard and fast, and May caught a shoulder with hers and almost went down and kept moving. The second horse wouldn't come. She could hear it, but not reach it. And the smoke was thicker now, low at her knees and building. And she went to her hands and crawled the last 6 feet to the stall and got the latch open from the ground and slapped the horse's legs and yelled, and the horse went over her and she rolled and came up coughing. She heard Garrett shout. Not words. Just her name, the shape of it, the way someone shouted a name when they'd run out of time for anything else. She moved toward it. He had the last horse, a big roan, heaviest of the 3, and the roan had locked up the way horses did in fire, all the survival instinct gone wrong, legs, stiff head down, not responding to anything. Garrett was pulling and making no progress, and a beam above them was glowing orange along its entire length. May came up on the horse's left side. She put her mouth close to the roan's ear. She talked. She talked the way she'd talked to Goliath in the dark of a gully at 2 a.m. Steady, low, absolute. The voice that said, "I am not afraid," which was a lie, but the right kind of lie, the kind that served something. The roan's ear swiveled. She walked forward. The horse walked with her. They came out of the barn door at a stumble, all 3 of them into the cold air and the noise and the chaos of the yard, and May bent over with her hands on her knees and coughed until there was nothing left to cough, and when she straightened up, Will Boone was standing 6 feet away. He was looking at her with those light, open eyes. Then he looked past her at his father. Then he looked up over her shoulder and his face changed. "Behind you," Will said. His voice was high and clear and absolutely certain. "He's behind you." May turned. Ingram was at the edge of the yard. He had a rifle, not aimed at her, not aimed at Garrett. Aimed at the space between them, the way a man aimed when he hadn't yet decided what he was going to do, but wanted everyone to understand that he was the one deciding. The yard went silent except for the fire. "I built that operation," Ingram said. His voice was rough. Not the lawyer voice, not the reasonable voice. The voice underneath both of those, the one that had been there all along. 4 years. Every horse I moved, every brand I changed, every deal I made, that was mine. Boone got the profit because it was his name on the land, but the work was mine. Garrett stood very still. Put the rifle down, Clay. I put everything I had into this ranch, Ingram said. Everything. And then His eyes moved to May. She walks in here out of nowhere, leads your horse home like some kind of miracle, and in 2 days she's eating at your table and sleeping in your yard, and you're looking at her like... He stopped. His jaw worked. Like she matters more than 4 years. Put the rifle down, Garrett said again. I killed Carver because he was going to talk, Ingram said. And saying it out loud seemed to surprise him, the way confessions sometimes surprise the person making them, the truth coming out bigger and more final than expected. He'd seen one of the horses I moved. He knew the brand. He was going to cut her. He paused. I didn't plan it. The fire was eating through the roof of the south barn now. May could hear it above everything. Clay, Garrett said, and his voice was different, not commanding, not flat, but something human underneath the way it sounded when he talked about his wife, the way it sounded when he said, your son needs her kindness. Whatever you've done, you don't want to make it worse. Not here. Not in front of that boy. Ingram's eyes went to Will. Will did not move. He stood with his feet planted and his face set, and he looked at Ingram the way a Boone looked at things that needed to be looked at straight. Something in Ingram's face broke open. Not softened. Broke. The way something broke when the last thing holding it gave way. His rifle arm dropped 6 inches. May moved. She didn't think about it. She moved the way she'd moved into the burning barn without enough information and without enough time, and with the understanding that waiting was a choice too, and sometimes the worse one. She crossed the 6 feet between them and got both hands on the rifle barrel before Ingram had processed that she was moving, and she pulled down and sideways with everything she had, and Ingram held on for 1 second. 1 terrible second where it could have gone either way, and then Garrett was there, and it was over. The rifle hit the ground. Ingram hit the ground 1 second later, Garrett's hand on his collar, and he didn't fight it. He went down like a man who had been fighting for a long time and had finally run out of fight. The yard was very quiet. Then Prentice said from somewhere to May's left, "Well, I'll be damned," which was the second time she'd heard him say that, and the context was different enough that she might have laughed if her hands weren't shaking. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. She hadn't noticed until now. She made them stop, or tried to. Garrett looked at her across the yard. She looked back. Will crossed the yard in 7 quick steps and stood beside her, not touching her, just there, present the way children stood beside the things they had decided to trust. Rosa appeared in the doorway of the house and looked at Ingram on the ground, and at the burning barn, and at May, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had been waiting for several years for several things to happen, and was processing the fact that they had all happened at once. Marshall Cutter rode through the gate 40 seconds later, which meant he had turned back from Creedy Pass for reasons May never fully learned, and which meant that the man on the ground in Garrett Boone's yard went from Ingram's problem to the law's problem in the space of a breath. Cutter looked at everything. He looked at May. He looked at the rifle on the ground. He looked at Ingram. "I'll need statements from everyone," he said. He said it the way men said things when they were doing the job, and nothing else, all the drama stripped out of it. "Starting with you, Miss Sutton." "Yes, sir," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands had finally stopped. Garrett Boone had not looked away from her since Cutter came through the gate, and she was aware of it, the way you were aware of heat from a fire that had burned down to coals. Not sharp, not dramatic, but present and warm and real. The south barn burned through its roof and partially collapsed before the hands got the water moving, and when the smoke finally thinned and the night came fully down on Boone Ranch, what was left standing was the stone foundation and one blackened corner beam that refused to fall. Will Boone stood and looked at it for a long time. Then he turned to May, who was sitting on the fence rail with her coat wrapped around her and ash in her hair, and he said, "You went in there twice." "Yes." "For the horses?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "My mama would have done that," he said. May looked at him. He looked back at her with his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and something in between that was entirely his own. And in the deep ash-scented quiet of the yard with Ingram in the marshal's custody, and Garrett Boone somewhere behind her, and Goliath standing at the fence, watching nothing in particular, May Sutton felt something she had not felt in longer than she could easily remember. Not safe. Not yet. But close. Marshal Cutter took statements until midnight. He sat at Garrett's dining table with his notebook open and his coffee going cold, and he listened, the way good lawmen listened, without expression, without leading, without letting you know what he thought, until he had heard everything he intended to hear. May went first. She told it straight through from Creedy Pass to the burning barn, without embellishment, and without leaving anything out, including the things that made her look uncertain or slow, because she had learned that a story with no rough edges looked like a story that had been polished, and polished stories made careful men suspicious. Cutter wrote and did not interrupt. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment. "You said Ingram's rifle arm dropped before you moved," he said. "Yes." "You think he was going to shoot?" May thought about it honestly. "I think he hadn't decided yet, and I didn't want to give him time to." Cutter wrote something. "That was either very brave or very reckless." "Probably both," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Probably," he agreed. Garrett went next. His statement was shorter and more precise. Dates, horse counts, the specific brands he'd found in the far pasture, the paper trail Ingram had constructed in the Double B's own ledger books. He spoke like a man cataloging damage, methodical and unemotional. And May watched him from the doorway, and understood that the emotion was there, all of it just held somewhere. Cutter couldn't see it. Rosa brought fresh coffee without being asked. Will was supposed to be in bed and wasn't, which everyone in the room knew and nobody addressed, because some nights the rules bent under the weight of what had happened. Prentice came in at 10 o'clock and sat down and said without preamble, "I want to say something." Cutter looked at him. "Ingram told me things about the woman," Prentice said. He didn't look at May directly. "This morning before he rode out. He told me she was connected to the horse thefts. He was specific about it. Named ranches, gave details." He paused. "I believed him. And I put myself in her way because of it." The room was quiet. "I'm saying it here in front of you and in front of her," Prentice said, "because if it goes in your report, I want it in there straight. Ingram lied to me, and I didn't question it because it was easier to believe a man I knew than a woman I didn't." May looked at him then. He met her eyes for exactly 1 second before looking away, and in that second, she saw something genuine, not comfortable, not easy, but genuine. The kind of honesty that costs something. "I hear you," she said. It was not forgiveness. He hadn't asked for it. But it was acknowledgement, and it was real, and he nodded at it and said nothing else. Cutter closed his notebook at 11:30. He stood up and put his hat on and looked at Garrett. "Ingram will be arraigned in county court," he said. "The murder charge on Carver is solid. He confessed in front of witnesses. The horse theft charges will take longer to sort, but your ledger books and those altered brands should do most of the work." He paused. "Your operation's going to get looked at hard for the next few months. You understand that?" "I understand," Garrett said. "The Double B's name is tied to this whether you knew about it or not." "I know." Cutter looked at him steadily. "A man who comes forward with his own evidence, who provides the ledger books, who doesn't try to protect himself at the expense of the facts." He paused. "That carries weight, in court and out of it." He picked up his coat. At the door he turned and looked at May. "Miss Sutton," he said. "I want to apologize." May looked at him. "I let Ingram's deputy ride out to Creedy Pass alone," Cutter said. "I should have gone myself from the start. That's on me." He held her gaze. "You had a right to better than what you got from this office." She had not expected that. She sat with it for a moment. "Thank you," she said. And then, because it was true and the man deserved the truth, Go home, Marshall. You've had a long day." He left. Rosa sent Will upstairs with a firmness that allowed no further negotiation, and Will went, though he managed to drag it out long enough to stop at the top step and look down at May one last time before Rosa's voice sent him the rest of the way. Then it was just Garrett and May in the dining room, and the lamp, and the particular silence of a house that had had a full day done to it, and was settling under the weight. Garrett sat across the table from her. He didn't say anything right away. He looked at his hands, the ranch-rough hands of a man who worked his own land with ash still in the creases from the fire, and he seemed to be deciding where to start, or whether to start, or how much starting a thing like this cost. May waited. "I owe you more than an apology," he said finally. "An apology's what you give somebody when you stepped on their foot." "What I did." He stopped. "I put you in Ingram's path. I left you in it. I told myself I was being careful, being reasonable, waiting for evidence." He looked up. "But what I was actually doing was letting somebody else take the risk of being wrong." May was quiet. "If Ingram had moved faster," he said. "If Cutter hadn't turned back when he did." "But he did," May said. "That's not good enough." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He held her gaze. "I don't know what I can offer you," he said. "That sounds like the start of something a man says when he's trying to soften something else, but I mean it plain. I don't know what I could say that would balance what happened, and I'm not going to try to." May looked at him for a long moment. "You went into that barn," she said. "Of course I did. My horses. With no coat over your face and no plan," she said. "You went in first." She paused. "Don't tell me you didn't know what you were doing." He was quiet. "I'm not absolved by one good thing," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it's in the account." She looked at her own hands. "I'm not ready to settle the whole account tonight, Garrett. I need—" She stopped, found the right word. "Time. Not because I'm angry. Because I need to understand what I'm giving trust to before I give it." He nodded slowly. "That's fair," he said. "I know it is," she said without edge. "That's why I said it." They sat in that for a moment, and it wasn't comfortable, but it was honest, and she had learned long ago to choose honesty over comfort when she had to pick one. "Stay," he said. It was one word, and he said it carefully, and it wasn't a plea and it wasn't a command. "Stay on at the ranch. Your own terms. Your own pace. I'll put it in writing if you want wages duties, whatever you say." She looked at him. "Why?" He seemed surprised by the directness of the question. Then he seemed to decide to answer it directly. "Because I've watched you work for 2 days, and you're the best person with horses I've ever seen, including my wife and including myself," he said. "Because Will has said more words in the last 48 hours than he's said in the last 6 months combined. Because Goliath trusts you, and that horse doesn't trust anyone, and I don't know how to argue with a horse that old and that difficult when he's made up his mind." He paused. "And because whatever happened between you and the rest of this ranch, it isn't finished. And I'd rather it finished in a direction I chose than in one that happened to me." May looked at him for a long time. "I'll stay through the winter," she said finally. "We'll see what's true after that." Garrett nodded. "Through the winter," he said, like he was marking it, making it real. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I'm a hard worker and a harder critic, and I don't pretend to be otherwise." "I know," he said, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did. "Rosa told me—" May blinked. "Rosa's known me 2 days." "Rosa," he said, "knows everything in about 6 hours. I don't know how. I stopped questioning it years ago." It was the first almost light thing he'd said to her, the first thing with a little air in it, and it landed between them differently than everything else had, softer and therefore more dangerous in its own way. She stood up. "Good night, Garrett," she said. He stood too. Old manners, the kind that ran deep. "Good night, May," he said. She walked back to the tack room in the cold, and Goliath was at the fence, and she stopped and stood beside the horse for a while in the dark without saying anything. just being near him, and he put his great head down and breathed against her shoulder. And she put her hand on his neck, and neither of them moved for a long time. The morning broke cold and clear and entirely different from any morning before it. Word had gotten to town overnight, the way word always got to town, through the man who'd ridden in with Cutter, through the deputy who'd been there when Ingram confessed, through whatever invisible current ran between ranches and main streets, in small counties where everyone's business was ultimately everyone else's business too. By the time May and Garrett rode into Caldwell's Crossing for the formal statement filing, people already knew the shape of it. That was when May learned what public reversal actually felt like. It felt smaller than she'd expected, and stranger and more complicated. It started at the edge of town. A man she didn't know tipped his hat to her as she rode past. Just that, a hat tip, a single small gesture of acknowledgement. But it hit her somewhere unexpected, because 48 hours ago those same eyes would have looked past her like she wasn't there. Mabel Greer was on the street when they came past the boarding house, and she stopped and said, "May." And there was a fullness to the word, the way you said a name when you were glad it was still there to say. "Mabel," May said. "You'll eat breakfast here before you go back?" Mabel said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am," May said. At the marshal's office, 3 men were waiting who hadn't been there the night before. 2 of them May didn't recognize. The third was a wide-weathered rancher who introduced himself as Frank Holt, and he took off his hat when he saw her and said, "I hear you're the one who broke this open." "I noticed a brand," May said. "Cutter broke it open." Holt shook his head. 14 horses, Miss Sutton. 14 head I raised from foal gone in one night. I've been looking for answers for 6 weeks. His jaw was tight with something that wasn't anger anymore, more like the aftermath of anger, the exhausted, heavy thing that lived on the other side of it. My foreman quit. My hands didn't trust my judgment. My wife thought I was losing my mind, riding out every night looking for tracks that led nowhere. He stopped. Nobody wanted to look at Ingram because Boone backed him, and nobody wanted to trouble Boone. He paused again. Because of a woman who walked 30 miles in the dark, there's justice for Pete Carver, and there's a chance I see my horses again. He put his hat back on. I won't forget it. May didn't know what to do with that. She nodded because it was real, and it deserved acknowledgement, and she didn't deflect it because deflecting real things was its own kind of dishonesty. Inside Cutter's office, the formal statement process was slower and more careful than the night before. A county prosecutor had ridden in from the district seat, a compact, intense man named Aldous Webb, who asked every question from 3 different angles and wrote everything in a hand so small it looked like a different language. He went through May's account like a man taking apart a clock, precise, relentless, interested in every mechanism. Halfway through, he looked up and said, "You understand that Ingram's defense is going to come at you?" "I expect it will," May said. "His defense counsel will argue your presence at the Carver site, your possession of the horse, your unknown origins." "My unknown origins," she repeated. Webb looked at her steadily. He was not unkind. He was just thorough. "You have no family in this territory, no permanent residence, no one who can speak to your character in this county beyond people you've known less than a week." "That's true," she said. "Then we need to establish your character through action," he said. "Everything you did in order with witnesses, and the physical evidence, the scar on your arm, the condition of the wire at the gully site, the positioning of the body relative to Ingram's account." He tapped his notebook. "That's our foundation. The rest builds on it." "All right," she said. "This will take months," he said. "You understand that. Ingram will make it take months." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Webb looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read, not surprise but something adjacent to it. "Good," he said. Garrett was in the hall outside Cutter's office when she came out, and he fell into step beside her without a word, the way people walked together when they'd stopped needing to announce it. "Webb is good," Garrett said. "He's thorough," May said. "Same thing out here." They walked the length of the hall and out into the street, and Mabel Greer's breakfast was waiting, and the morning was cold and bright, and full of the particular clarity that came after something had burned away. Mabel had made eggs and cornbread and real coffee, the kind that announced itself before you were through the door, and she sat down with them instead of hovering, which told May something about how Mabel viewed the situation. "People are talking," Mabel said, direct as always. "Let them," May said. "They're talking in the right direction," Mabel said. "For a change." She looked at Garrett. "There are 3 ranch wives in this county who've had their husbands riding to Boone Ranch for 6 weeks, convinced that ranch had something to do with their missing stock. You might want to talk to them." "I intend to," Garrett said. He said it quietly, with the weight of a man who understood the full cost of what had been done under his name. "And Reverend Doyle," Mabel added, "wants to speak to you, May." May's coffee cup stopped. "About what?" she said. "About reading your character to the congregation," Mabel said. "Apparently the church that was most ready to judge you on the way in wants to be first in line to speak on your behalf going forward." May set her cup down. "He doesn't need to do that," she said carefully. "I know he doesn't need to," Mabel said. "He wants to. There's a difference." She looked at May with the directness of a woman who had seen a great deal of human behavior and had formed settled opinions about most of it. "Let people make it right when they're trying to honey. It doesn't cost you anything, and it costs them something real." May sat with that. She thought about Prentice last night. I believed him, because it was easier, and the look on his face when he said it. She thought about Cutter saying, "I should have gone myself from the start." She thought about Frank Holt's 14 horses and the wife who thought he was losing his mind. "All right," she said. Then Mabel said, "There's something else." And her voice changed careful now, the way Mabel's voice became when she was delivering something she wasn't sure how it would land. May looked at her. "Pete Carver's wife," Mabel said. "Eleanor Carver. She came in this morning. She wants to speak with you." The table went very quiet. "She knows who you are," May said. "She came looking for you," Mabel said. "By name." May was still. She hadn't thought about a wife. She had thought about Carver as a dying man, a stranger, a person she had done a decent thing for, and then carried forward into everything that followed. She hadn't thought past that to the life he'd left behind, the house he'd ridden away from, that last morning, not knowing it was the last one. "Where is she?" May said. "Waiting at the boarding house." May pushed back her chair. Eleanor Carver was small and dry-eyed, and somewhere in her 40s, with the look of a woman who had cried everything out before coming here, and arrived now with nothing left but purpose. She was sitting in Mabel's front parlor, with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and when May came through the door, she stood up and looked at her with an intensity that would have been frightening if it hadn't also been so clearly the intensity of grief. "You were with him," Eleanor said. Not a question. "Yes," May said. "At the end." "Yes." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, reading her face the way desperate people read faces, searching for something, for a specific something they needed to know was there. "Was he afraid?" she said. May thought about Pete Carver's face in the dark at Creedy Pass, the way he'd gripped her hand, the things he'd said. "He was in pain," May said honestly. "But when I got to him, he wasn't alone anymore, and that mattered to him. You could see it." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. "What did he say?" she said. Her voice was even. It was costing her everything to keep it even. May sat down across from her. "He said, 'Take the horse home,'" she said. "He said, 'Warn the Boone rancher.' He gave me the horse's lead and he made me promise." She paused. "He said your name, Ellie. He said it more than once." Eleanor Carver closed her eyes. She sat that way for a moment. When she opened them, something had shifted in her face. Not better. Not healed. Nothing as simple as that. But different. Like a wound that had been covered, now exposed to air, which hurt more in the short run and healed better in the long one. "Thank you," she said, "for burying him properly." "It was the right thing," May said. "A lot of people know the right thing," Eleanor said. "Fewer do it when it's inconvenient." She looked at May directly. "You did it when it cost you everything." May shook her head. "It cost me some hard days," she said. "It cost Pete Carver his life. Those aren't the same." Eleanor was quiet. "His horses?" she said finally. "The ones that were stolen. They're proof now, aren't they? The altered brands." "They're evidence, yes." "Will I get them back?" "Some of them," May said carefully. "The ones that can be identified. It may take time." Eleanor nodded slowly, processing. "The ranch won't survive without them," she said. It was fact, not complaint. The flat arithmetic of a small frontier operation where 40 head was the difference between staying and not staying. "I have 2 hands and a boy of 16. We can work the land if we have stock to work it with. Without them?" She stopped. May looked at her. She thought about 14 horses in Garrett Boone's far pasture with altered brands. She thought about a man who had said, "I'll put it in writing if you want wages duties, whatever you say." "Mrs. Carver," she said, "I'd like you to come out to the Double B tomorrow. There are some horses I think you should look at." Eleanor Carver looked at her steadily. "Why would Garrett Boone do anything for me?" she said. "Not hostile, just real. Because those horses ended up in his pasture through fraud, and because Garrett Boone is a man who understands what it means to owe something." May paused. "And because I'm going to ask him." Eleanor was very still. "You can do that," she said. "I don't know," May said honestly, "but I'm going to find out." She went back to Mabel's dining room, and Garrett was still there, and she sat down across from him and looked at him directly. "Eleanor Carver is here," she said. He met her eyes. "I know. She has a 16-year-old boy and 2 hands and a ranch that needs 40 horses to survive," May said. "Some of those horses are in your far pasture right now. The altered brands can be reversed. Cutter can document the originals before they're rebranded." Garrett was quiet. "You're asking me to return stock that was moved through my operation," he said. "I'm asking you to do the right thing," May said. "Which you know how to do. You just don't always do it fast enough." The last part landed flat and clear, and she didn't soften it. Garrett looked at her. "No," he said. "I don't." He held her gaze. "Set up the meeting." May nodded once. "Today," she said. "Today," he agreed. She stood up and went to find Eleanor Carver, and behind her, she heard Garrett drain the last of his coffee and push back his chair, and she heard in that small, ordinary sound the particular weight of a man who had decided to stop being careful in the wrong ways. When they rode back to the Double B that afternoon, May and Garrett and Eleanor Carver and a deputy for documentation, Prentice, was waiting at the gate. He was holding his hat in his hands, which was not something May had seen him do before. He looked at May. "The hands want to know," he said. "Are you staying?" The question hung in the cold air. Garrett glanced at May. He didn't speak. It was not his answer to give. May looked at Prentice, at his hands working the brim of the hat, at the 5 or 6 faces visible behind him near the barn, all doing the same careful, not watching that meant they were listening. "I'm staying," May said. Prentice nodded. He put his hat back on. "All right then," he said, as though that settled something that had been unsettled for days, and stepped aside to let them through the gate. Will was on the porch. He saw May, and something crossed his face that was too big for 9 years old to hold steady. So it came out as movement. He came off the porch and across the yard at a run, and stopped 2 feet from her horse, looking up at her with those light, clear eyes. "Rosa said you might leave," he said. "This morning when you went to town. She said people sometimes don't come back." "Rosa was right to be careful," May said. "But I came back." Will swallowed. "Are you going to keep coming back?" he said. And in the question was everything a child asked when they had already lost one person they counted on and were not sure they could trust the counting again. May looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. And she meant it the way she meant things all the way through, with no reservation left over. Will reached up and put his hand briefly on her horse's neck, the way children touch things they couldn't quite say what they meant about, and then he turned and walked back to the porch with the studied composure of someone trying not to let you see how much they meant what they just did. Garrett beside her was looking at his son. May looked at the side of Garrett's face, the jaw, the careful eyes, the slight softness around them that she only saw when he was looking at Will. "He's going to be fine," she said quietly. Garrett turned and looked at her. "Yes," he said. After a moment, "I think he is." Winter came to the Double B, the way winter came to that part of the territory, without apology, and without warning, 3 days of cold that deepened into a week, and then the week became the season, and the season became the rhythm of the ranch. May learned that rhythm the way she learned everything, by paying attention. She learned which horses needed extra feed before a temperature drop, and which ones ran warm enough to need less. She learned that Rosa made coffee at 5 sharp, and that Garrett was always already up when she did, sitting at the table in the dark with his ledger books and a lamp turned low. Not doing the books, but reading them the way a man read the record of something that had gone wrong under his watch, and was trying to understand every point where he could have looked and didn't. She learned that Will talked more in the barn than anywhere else, and that if you wanted to know what was actually going on inside him on any given day, you listened to what he said to the horses, not to the people. She learned that Garrett had 3 different kinds of silence, and all of them meant different things. None of this was what she'd planned when she walked into Caldwell's Crossing leading a black stallion with blood on her hands and dust in her hair. But plans she had learned a long time ago were the first thing the world revised. Ingram's trial date was set for February, and the weeks leading up to it sharpened everything at the ranch. The way cold sharpened edges. The air felt different. The days felt deliberate. Every conversation had something underneath it that wasn't quite said. Aldous Webb rode out twice in November with more questions and a new notebook, and each time he came, he stayed longer and left looking more settled, which May took as a good sign without letting herself count on it. She had learned not to count on outcomes that hadn't happened yet. She sat across from him and answered what he asked, and volunteered what she thought he needed, and didn't perform confidence she didn't have. "Ingram's counsel is running a character argument," Webb told her on his second visit across Garrett's dining table. "They can't refute the physical evidence, the brands, the ledger discrepancies, the confession in front of witnesses. So they're going to argue motive. Specifically, they're going to argue that you had reason to frame him." May looked at him. "What reason?" she said. "They're saying you knew Carver personally, that his death wasn't an ambush he stumbled into, but something connected to your history in San Marcos." Webb watched her carefully. "I need to know if there's anything in San Marcos that can be used against you." The table was quiet. Garrett did not look away from her. May sat with the question for a moment, not because she was hiding something, but because she was deciding how much to open and how fast, and whether Webb needed all of it or just the relevant part. "My husband died in San Marcos," she said. 18 months ago. He was thrown from a horse, that's what the inquest said." She paused. "I never believed it. He was the best rider I knew." Webb was writing. "There were men in San Marcos who wanted our land," she said. "They'd made offers. My husband refused. After he died, I didn't have the money or the standing to fight what came next." She looked at her hands. "I left. Not because I was running from anything illegal. Because staying meant losing everything slowly instead of quickly, and I chose quickly." Webb looked up. "Names," he said. "Harlan Moss, and his 2 sons." She said it flat and clean. "I don't know if they're connected to Ingram. I don't have proof they had anything to do with my husband's death. But if Ingram's counsel is reaching into my past, that's the direction they'll find." Webb wrote. Garrett said, "We should know before they use it." "Yes," Webb said. "I'll wire the San Marcos County office today." He looked at May. "Is there anything else?" She thought. "My husband's name was Daniel Sutton," she said. "He was a good man, and he deserved better than what he got, and so did I, and I've been trying to get to a place where I could say both of those things out loud without it costing me something." She held Webb's gaze. "You can put that in your notebook, too." Webb did. He left an hour later, and Rosa brought coffee, and Garrett sat across from May in the quiet and said, "You never told me about Daniel." "You didn't ask," she said. "No?" He agreed. "I should have." She looked at him. "It wasn't your business until it was." "Is it my business now?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." She told him then not the whole of it, but the shape of it. Daniel, who had laughed easily and worked hard and trusted the wrong men in business because he trusted everyone in life. The ranch in San Marcos that they'd built together from almost nothing. The men who wanted the water rights and wanted them badly enough to make quiet arrangements. The morning she'd found him at the bottom of a draw with his horse standing nearby, uninjured, calm, which was the detail that had never made sense to her and never would. Garrett listened. The way he listened. Still complete, nothing wasted. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. And it was not a performative sorry, not the kind people said to fill silence. It was the kind that meant, "I understand what that cost, and I cannot fix it, and I am sorry it happened to you." "Thank you," she said. "If Ingram's counsel reaches into San Marcos and finds Moss," Garrett said slowly, "and if Moss is connected to Ingram, then my husband's death wasn't an accident," May said, "and it becomes part of the same case." "Yes." She had known that. She had been knowing it at the back of her mind since Webb's first visit, turning it carefully, not yet ready to say it out loud, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that carrying it silently didn't. "I want to know," she said. "Whatever it is, I want to know." "We'll find out," Garrett said. It was not a promise he could fully keep. He knew that, and so did she. But it was said with the full weight of a man who meant to try, and that was more than nothing. That night, Will found her in the barn at 9 o'clock, when he was supposed to be asleep, and they both knew it. He climbed up on the fence beside Goliath's stall and said without preamble, "Papa told me about your husband." May looked at him. "He said you've had a hard time," Will said. "He said sometimes people get hard times that aren't fair." "That's true," May said. "My mama's death wasn't fair," Will said. "She wasn't sick. She just—" He stopped. He had his father's jaw set and his mother's eyes wet, and he was fighting both of them at the same time. The wagon wheel broke. That was all. Just a wheel. His voice went rough at the end. Things shouldn't be allowed to happen just because of a wheel. May stepped closer to him but didn't touch him. "No," she said. "They shouldn't." "Do you still miss him?" Will asked. "Your husband." "Yes," she said honestly. "Not the same way I used to, but yes." Will nodded, processing. "Papa still misses Mama. He thinks I don't know, but I know." He paused. "He smiles more when you're around." May was very still. "Will," she said carefully. "I'm not saying it to say something," he said with a 9-year-old's dignity. "I'm saying it because it's true and because I think he won't say it himself for a long time and somebody should." He looked at her directly. "He's better when you're here, and so am I." May looked at this boy with his impossible clear eyes and his impossible directness. "You're going to be something remarkable," she said quietly. Will considered this. "Rosa says I'm already remarkable. She says I'm just not done yet." "Rosa's right," May said. "As usual." Will almost smiled. Then he looked at Goliath and said, "He watches you sleep." May blinked. "What?" "At night. I've seen him from my window. He stands at the fence and faces the tack room." Will paused. "Horses don't do that for people they're not sure of." She looked at the black horse. Goliath looked back at her with those flat amber eyes. "No," she said. "They don't." "Go to bed, Will," she said. He went. But she heard him say at the barn door without turning around, "Good night, May." "Good night," she said. The trial lasted 4 days in February, which was longer than anyone had expected and shorter than Webb had prepared for. Ingram's counsel did exactly what Webb had said they would do. They brought up San Marcos. They brought up Harlan Moss, who turned out to have no connection to Ingram that could be proved in court, but whose name in the room did what names did in small counties, which was create a feeling of complication, of murky water, of a woman with a past too tangled to see clearly. May sat through it without flinching. The flinching happened on the inside, in the part of her that heard her husband's name said by a defense attorney in a tone that made it sound like evidence of something shameful, and she kept that part absolutely still and quiet, and gave it nothing to show the room. Garrett sat beside her every day of the trial. He didn't make a production of it. He simply sat there on the bench beside her, present and solid. And when the defense attorney made his most aggressive run at her character on the third day, and the room shifted in that complicated way rooms shifted when a woman's past was being inventoried in public, she felt Garrett's hand come down briefly on hers on the bench between them. Not grabbing, just there. 1 second, maybe 2, then gone. She didn't look at him, but she felt something settle in her chest that had been loose since Creedy Pass. The jury took 6 hours. They came back with guilty on the murder charge and guilty on 8 counts of horse theft and 2 counts of fraud. When the foreman read it out, the courtroom was very quiet for one long moment, and then it wasn't, and in the noise May sat very still and looked at her hands and breathed. Beside her, Garrett exhaled slowly. She looked at him then. He was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had been holding something up for months and had just been allowed to set it down. "It's done," he said. "Most of it," she said. He looked at her. "Webb wired me this morning," she said, "before the verdict." She paused. "The San Marcos County office found something. About the wheel on the wagon that killed your wife." He went very still. "Garrett," she said carefully, "it wasn't your wife's wagon." He stared at her. "It was Ingram's wagon," she said. "He'd borrowed it the week before. The county records show a report filed by a livery owner who said the wheel had a crack in the axle pin when Ingram returned it." She held his gaze. "Nobody followed up on the report at the time, but it's there, with Ingram's name." The courtroom noise continued around them. Nobody was watching them. The moment was entirely private, in the middle of a public room, which was its own kind of grace. Garrett's face did something she had never seen it do. It broke open. Not into grief, or not only grief, but into something that came before grief, the thing that existed on the other side of years of not knowing which was worse in its own way, because it had no shape to hold. He looked like a man who had been carrying a question for 2 years and had just received an answer that was terrible and true, and also somehow a relief because at least the question was finished. May didn't move. She didn't reach for him. She sat beside him and let him have it. After a moment, he put his hand over his face. She waited. When he brought it down, his eyes were red, but his voice was level. "You knew this morning," he said. "Yes." "You sat through the whole verdict without saying anything." "The verdict needed to be the verdict," she said. "This needed to be this." She paused. "They're separate things." He looked at her for a long time. "May," he said, and her name in his voice sounded different from any of the times he'd said it before, like something that had gone through fire and come out changed in a way that was not damage. "Not here," she said quietly. "Not today. Today belongs to the verdict, and to Eleanor Carver, and to whatever you need to carry about your wife." She held his gaze. "There'll be time for the rest." He held her gaze for another long moment. Then he nodded once. They walked out of the courthouse into the February cold, and Mabel Greer was waiting on the steps with Eleanor Carver beside her, and Eleanor looked at May and said, "They got him." And her voice broke clean in half on the last word, and she put her hand over her mouth, and May stepped forward and put her arms around the woman and held on. Spring came slow and deliberate, the way it always did in that country, and by the time the ground thawed enough to work it properly, the Double B had changed in ways that were both visible and not. The south barn was rebuilt. Garrett had ordered it rebuilt with the same stone foundation and the same timber, and he'd had the crew leave one blackened beam in place above the main door, fixed and treated so it would hold. because he said a ranch ought to remember what it survived. Prentice had overseen the construction and done it well, and somewhere in those weeks of work alongside the other hands, May noticed that Prentice had stopped being a man who told her things about herself and started being a man who listened when she spoke, which was a more significant change than it might have sounded. Holt got 11 of his horses back. Eleanor Carver got 9 of her 14, and the remaining 5 were compensated through a settlement that Webb had negotiated with more tenacity than anyone had expected from a man his size. Eleanor's 16-year-old boy rode over to the Double B in March to thank May personally, and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said, "My mother says you saved us." And May said, "Your mother saved herself. I just moved some things out of her way." The boy looked at her and said, "Yes, ma'am," in a tone that suggested he was old enough to understand the generosity in that framing. The day Will Boone rode Goliath for the first time, May was in the breaking pen, and Garrett was at the fence, and Rosa was on the porch, and no one had planned it. Will had been spending more time with the Stallion all spring, not riding, just being near him, feeding him from his hand, brushing him in long, slow strokes, while he talked in the low, steady way he'd learned from watching May. Goliath had tolerated this, then accepted it, then sought it the way the horse sought things he had decided were worth his time. It started because Will climbed up on the fence to reach the horse's neck, and Goliath leaned into him, and Will, without thinking it through, swung his leg over. May saw it happen. She did not move toward them. She did not call out. She held absolutely still and watched and breathed. Goliath stood flat-footed and still. Will looked down at the horse beneath him, with an expression that was pure astonishment. Astonishment at the horse, at himself, at the fact that the thing he'd been afraid to want had just given itself to him without being asked. Then he looked up and found his father at the fence. Garrett was looking at his son on his father's horse, and the look on his face was the look of a man watching two things past and present meet and hold the look of grief and something better than grief existing in the same moment. "Papa," Will said. His voice was careful with awe. "I see you," Garrett said. "He let me," Will said. "I know," Garrett said. May turned back to the horse she was working and did not let them see her face for a moment, because her face was doing things she hadn't asked it to do, and some things were private even when you were glad of them. It was Garrett who found her that evening, sitting on the fence outside Goliath's stall in the blue hour before full dark. And he came and stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while, which had become one of their better languages. "Webb sent a final letter," Garrett said. "About San Marcos." She waited. "They're not moving forward with a formal investigation," he said. "Not enough physical evidence at this point. Moss's lawyers are thorough." He paused. "But the crack in the axle pin is on record. Ingram's name is on record. Webb says it's not finished, it's just waiting for something to turn." May nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "That's not enough," Garrett said. "No," she agreed. "It's not. But it's something." She looked out at the pasture. "Daniel would say take the something and don't mourn the rest until you have to." Garrett was quiet. "He sounds like he was a good man," he said. "He was," she said. "He was impractical and too trusting, and he made decisions with his heart when his head should have been in charge." She paused. "I loved him very much." "I know," Garrett said, simply, without complication. She looked at him. "Your wife," she said. "What was she like?" He took a slow breath. The question had lived between them since February, and she had waited to ask it until it felt like a door rather than a wound. "Stubborn," he said. "The most stubborn person I've ever known, and I grew up in a county full of ranchers, so that's saying something." A pause. "She argued with everything on principle. Every decision I made, she asked me why at least 3 times. Drove me insane." Another pause, and in it something warm. "I made better decisions because of it." He looked at the fence post. "She would have argued with Ingram inside of 20 minutes. She would have seen what I didn't." "You see it now," May said. "Late?" he said. "Yes," she agreed. But you see it." He turned and looked at her. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said in October, through the winter. We'll see what's true after that." She met his eyes. "I know what I think is true," he said. "I've known it for a while. But I told you I'd give you time, and I meant it, and I'm not going to push at something you haven't decided yet." He held her gaze steady. "I just want to know if you're still deciding." May sat with the question. She thought about a gully in the dark, and a dying man's hand in hers, and a promise made to a stranger. She thought about 30 miles of road, and cold and fear, and a horse that chose to trust her before any human did. She thought about a dining room table with a lamp turned low and ledger books, and a man who punished himself for not seeing what he should have seen. She thought about a boy on the fence in the blue light saying, "I see you." She thought about what it meant to be somewhere. Not because you were trapped or lost or out of options, but because you had looked at the thing in front of you and decided it was worth staying for. "I've decided," she said. Garrett was very still. "I'm not easy," she said. "I need to tell you that straight because I think you know it and I want to say it out loud. I'm going to disagree with you. I'm going to tell you when you're wrong. I'm going to ask why 3 times before I accept an answer at minimum." "I know," he said. "I'm going to have opinions about the horses that you're not going to like." "I already know," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "And I'm going to need—" She stopped. Found it. "I'm going to need the truth to be the only currency between us. Not kindness pretending to be truth. Not carefulness standing in for it. The actual thing." He looked at her for a long moment. "May Sutton," he said, "I have been a lot of things in my life, and most of them I'd do differently given the chance. But I have never lied to a person who asked me straight. I'm not going to start with you." She held his gaze. Then she looked out at the pasture where Goliath stood in the last of the light. Head up, watching the open range with the attention of a horse that had been somewhere hard and come back and hadn't forgotten either part. "Then ask me to stay," she said. He turned toward her. "May," he said. "Stay." She looked at him. "All right," she said. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was not a scene. It was 2 people who had looked at each other through fire and suspicion and grief and the slow accumulating weight of ordinary days and had decided without theater that the looking was worth continuing. That was enough. More than enough. The summer came, and Goliath ran free across the south pasture most mornings, and Will rode him twice a week with a lightness that had nothing to do with inexperience and everything to do with trust, and people who saw them said afterward that they'd never seen a horse and a boy look more like they belonged to each other. The breaking pen at the Double B became known across 3 counties, and women brought difficult horses to May, the way they'd once brought difficult problems to people they trusted. Because word had gotten out, not announced, just spread the way true things spread, that there was a woman at the Boone Ranch who understood what animals needed before they knew how to ask for it. Eleanor Carver's ranch stayed standing. Mabel Greer told anyone who would listen exactly how it had stayed standing and whose name belonged on that particular chapter of the story, and Mabel Greer's accounts were not argued with in Caldwell's Crossing, because Mabel had been right too many times in a row to be doubted conveniently. And on an August evening, when the light was the gold that light got, at the end of summer before it started to shorten, Garrett Boone came to find May at the fence where she was watching Goliath run, and he took something from his shirt pocket and held it out to her. It was a watch. She looked at it. Old silver, well kept. A repair seam along the hinge where someone had had it fixed carefully. "It was my father's," Garrett said. "Before it was Ingram's ledger of what he owed us. Before it was any of that." He paused. "Will found it when we took Ingram's quarters apart in November. He's been keeping it." He looked at her. "He asked me this morning to give it to you." May looked at the watch in his palm. "Why?" she said. He said. Garrett stopped. Something moved in his face. "He said you gave us back our time. He said it made sense for you to have a piece of it." May was quiet for a long moment. She picked up the watch. She turned it over in her hands. On the back, scratched into the silver in a child's careful letters, were 3 words that had not been there before. Will's handwriting, small and deliberate, and entirely sure of itself. She belongs here. May closed her hand around the watch. She looked out at Goliath running free across the summer pasture legs, stretching long and easy, the black coat catching the last of the light, and she thought about a woman who had walked 30 miles in the dark, holding a lead rope, and arrived in a strange town with nothing but the truth and the willingness to keep going. That woman had not expected any of this, but she had walked toward it one step at a time in the dark, without knowing what was at the end of the road, and what was at the end of the road had turned out to be worth every mile. May Sutton had walked into Caldwell's Crossing, leading a dead man's horse, accused of things she hadn't done, with nothing in her name and no one in her corner. She stood now on Boone land in the last of the August light, with a watch in her hand and a boy's 3 words on its back, and beside her, a man who had learned to see her, and ahead of her, a horse that had never doubted her once. She had not come here to be saved. She had come here because it was the right thing to do. And it turned out that doing the right thing when you were willing to keep doing it, even when it cost you, had a way of leading you home, even when you didn't know home was where you were going.